Hey guys, tonight we begin with something macabre, tender, and absolutely bewildering. The story of Queen Juana of Castile, a woman whose love for her husband was so profound, so consuming, that it survived death itself. We're talking about a queen who refused to let go, quite literally, keeping her deceased husband's corpse in her bedroom for weeks, traveling across Spain with his coffin, and holding conversations with a man who had been dead for months. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, it's 1506 in Burgos, Spain. You're a servant in the royal household, and your queen has just lost her husband. Not unusual. Death comes for everyone, even handsome Flemish princes. But what happens next defies every protocol, every tradition, every reasonable expectation of royal behavior. The queen, Juana, refuses to allow the burial. She keeps the corpse in her bedroom, opens the coffin daily to kiss the decomposing face, and insists on eating her meals next to what's left of Philip the Handsome. You're not dealing with grief. You're dealing with something that transcends it entirely. Something that makes the court whisper about madness, possession, and love so desperate it's become dangerous. You wake up to the sound of the queen talking. Not unusual, except she's talking to a dead man. Again. Through the stone walls of the palace you can hear her voice, soft and conversational, as if Philip were still alive, still capable of responding to her morning observations about the weather, the court, the way the light filters through the window. You've been told to ignore it, to pretend it's normal, but there's nothing normal about a queen who starts each day by greeting a corpse. The smell has gotten worse. Even with the expensive oils, the perfumes, the herbs packed around the body, there's an undercurrent of decay that permeates everything. The other servants have stopped entering the royal chambers unless absolutely necessary. You're one of the few who still goes in, mostly because someone has to, and partly because you're morbidly fascinated by the sight of a woman so completely devoted to the dead. Juana sits beside the coffin, her hand resting on the wood, speaking in the same gentle tones she once used when Philip was alive. She tells him about the affairs of state, about the letters from her father, about the children. She asks his opinion on matters of court, pauses as if listening to his response, then nods thoughtfully. It's not madness exactly, it's something more unsettling. She's lucid, articulate, perfectly aware of what she's doing. She simply refuses to accept that death means separation. To her, Philip is still there, still her husband, still the man she loves more than life itself. The fact that he's been dead for weeks is merely an inconvenience, not an ending. The morning ritual never changes. She opens the coffin, regardless of the state of the body inside. She kisses his forehead, his cheeks, his hands. She arranges his hair, adjusts his clothing, speaks to him as if he's simply sleeping deeply. The other courtiers have stopped trying to reason with her. Her father, Ferdinand, has sent letters demanding she allow the burial. The church has issued statements about proper Christian treatment of the dead. The people whisper about their mad queen. But Juana doesn't care. She's not mad, she's devoted. And devotion, she believes, doesn't end with death. You've seen grief before. You've seen widows weep, seen men collapse at gravesides, seen families torn apart by loss. But this is different. This isn't the acute pain of fresh loss or the slow healing of time. This is love refusing to acknowledge reality. Juana doesn't mourn Philip, she continues to live with him. She doesn't weep for what was lost. She insists nothing has been lost at all. The man she married is still there, still her husband, still the center of her world. The fact that he can't speak, can't move, can't respond, is just another challenge to overcome, like illness or travel or political intrigue. The court has adapted in the strangest ways. Meals are still served for two. Philip's place at the table remains set. His clothes are still laid out each morning. The servants speak in whispers, not out of respect for the dead, but because they're afraid of disrupting whatever delicate balance keeps the queen functional. Because functionally, surprisingly, she is. She still signs documents, still meets with advisors, still manages the business of ruling. She's not incapacitated by grief, she's empowered by denial. And that denial has become her strength. But you can see it taking its toll. Not on her mind, that remains sharp, on her body. She's thinner, paler, more fragile looking. She sleeps poorly, often waking to check on Philip, to make sure he's still there, still positioned correctly in his coffin. She eats little, drinks less. It's as if she's trying to join him without actually dying, to exist in the same liminal space between life and death that she's convinced he occupies. The living world holds less and less appeal for her. Reality has become something to be endured, not embraced. The smell has gotten so bad that even the most loyal servants gag when they enter the room. The corpse, despite all efforts to preserve it, is decomposing. The face that Juana kisses each morning is no longer recognizable as the handsome prince she married. But she doesn't seem to notice, or if she does, she doesn't care. Love, in her mind, transcends physical form. The body is just the shell, the container. The man she loves is still there, still present, still hers. The decay is temporary, an illusion. What matters is that they're together. You've started to wonder if she's right. Not about Philip being alive, that's clearly not the case. But about love continuing beyond death. Watching her, seeing her unwavering devotion, her complete commitment to their relationship despite its impossible circumstances, you begin to understand that she's not clinging to a corpse. She's maintaining a connection that death hasn't severed. In her mind, she's still married, still in love, still building a life with her husband. The fact that he's dead is just another obstacle to overcome, like political enemies or financial troubles. The other nobles have started avoiding the palace entirely. The smell, the atmosphere, the sight of their queen talking to a dead man, it's too much. They conduct business elsewhere, send messages through intermediaries, make excuses to avoid direct contact. But Juana doesn't seem to notice or care. She has Philip, and Philip is all she needs. The living world, with its demands and expectations and judgments, has become irrelevant. She's created her own reality, one where death is just another word for separation. And separation is something she refuses to accept. The church has escalated its demands. Proper burial, they insist. Christian dignity, respect for the dead. But Juana has her own interpretation of Christian love. Till death do us part, the wedding vows said. But she never agreed to those terms. She promised to love Philip forever, and forever doesn't have exceptions for death. The church can quote scripture about the living and the dead, but she has scripture too. Love is eternal. God is love. Therefore, her love for Philip is godly, holy, something to be honored, not buried. Months pass. The situation becomes more surreal, more impossible to ignore. The Queen of Spain is living with a corpse, ruling a kingdom while conducting a relationship with a dead man. It's unprecedented, scandalous, and somehow deeply moving. Because underneath the madness, underneath the obvious impossibility of it all, there's something pure about her devotion. She's not performing grief, she's not seeking attention or sympathy. She's simply refusing to let death win. She's fighting the ultimate battle, love against mortality, and she's convinced she's winning. The court physicians whisper about melancholy, about the way grief can transform into something else, something more dangerous. But when they observe her, she doesn't seem mentally ill. She's lucid, articulate, capable of complex thought and decision-making. She's not hallucinating, not hearing voices, not experiencing delusions. She simply has a different understanding of what death means. In her world, death is a change of state, not an ending. Philip is still Philip, still her husband, still the man she loves. He's just quieter than usual. You've begun to admire her, in a strange way. Not her choices, those are clearly impossible to support. But her commitment, her absolute refusal to compromise on what she believes love requires. She's not trying to bring Philip back to life. She's not denying that he's dead. She's simply refusing to let death change their relationship. It's insane, impossible, deeply disturbing. But it's also the most complete expression of love you've ever witnessed. She's not mourning what was lost. She's celebrating what continues. The smell has become unbearable. Even the most expensive perfumes, the strongest incense, the most elaborate preservation techniques can't mask the reality of decomposition. The other servants have started wearing cloths over their faces, breathing through their mouths, finding excuses to leave the room as quickly as possible. But Juana seems immune to it all. She sits beside the coffin, hand resting on the wood, speaking in soft tones about the day's events, the weather, the children. The physical reality of death hasn't touched her emotional reality of love. The political implications are becoming impossible to ignore. Spain needs a functioning queen, not a woman who spends her days conversing with a corpse. Her father has started making moves to have her declared unfit to take control of her kingdom. The nobles are nervous, the people are confused, and the international community is watching with a mixture of fascination and horror. But Juana doesn't seem concerned about any of this. She has Philip, and Philip is all she needs. The kingdom, the crown, the responsibilities of rulership, they're all secondary to her primary obligation, her marriage. The children visit less frequently now. It's disturbing for them to see their mother like this, to witness her conversations with their dead father. They're young, but they understand enough to know that something is wrong, that their mother is behaving in ways that make the adults uncomfortable. But when they do visit, Juana includes them in her conversations with Philip. She tells him about their progress, their health, their accomplishments. She asks his opinion on their education, their future, their needs. It's as if she's maintaining a family life that includes a dead father. The servants have developed elaborate strategies to avoid the royal chambers. They time their duties around Juana's schedule, enter only when absolutely necessary, and leave as quickly as possible. The smell, the sight, the sound of one-sided conversations, it's all too much. But someone has to maintain the household. Someone has to care for the queen. Someone has to pretend that this impossible situation is somehow manageable. And so they adapt, they endure, they find ways to function in a world that has stopped making sense. Juana's daily routine never varies. She wakes beside the coffin, greets Philip with the same tenderness she once showed the living man. She opens the coffin, kisses his decomposing face, arranges his clothing, speaks to him about the day ahead. She eats breakfast at a table set for two, carrying on conversations with an empty chair. She conducts the business of ruling, but always returns to the bedroom, to Philip, to the relationship that death hasn't ended. It's systematic, methodical, and completely insane. The international community has begun to take notice. Ambassadors send carefully worded dispatches to their home countries, describing the situation in terms that sound almost fictional. The Queen of Spain is living with her dead husband's corpse. She refuses to allow burial. She conducts conversations with the deceased. She rules a kingdom while maintaining a relationship with a dead man. It's the kind of story that would be dismissed as fantasy if it weren't so well documented, so thoroughly witnessed by so many reliable sources. The Church has moved from suggestions to demands to threats. Proper burial is not optional, they insist. Christian dignity requires respect for the dead. But Juana has her own understanding of Christian love. Love is eternal, she argues. God is love. Therefore, her love for Philip is holy, sacred, something to be honored, not buried. The Church can quote scripture about the living and the dead, but she has scripture too. Love never ends, Paul wrote. She's simply taking him literally. The practical challenges are enormous. The smell requires constant attention, expensive perfumes, elaborate air circulation systems. The preservation requires daily maintenance, careful positioning, regular applications of oils and herbs. The security requires guards who can stomach the sight and smell of decomposition. The diplomacy requires explanations that sound reasonable to foreign courts who have never encountered anything like this. It's a massive undertaking, all in service of a relationship with a dead man. But Juana doesn't see it as a problem to be solved. She sees it as a commitment to be honored. Philip is still her husband, still the man she loves, still the center of her world. The fact that he's dead is just another challenge to overcome, like illness or distance or political intrigue. She's not maintaining a corpse, she's maintaining a marriage. She's not preserving a dead body, she's preserving a living love. The physical reality of death hasn't touched the emotional reality of their relationship. The other courtiers have started to fear her, not because she's violent or threatening, but because she's so completely outside normal human experience. She's functioning in a reality where death doesn't end relationships, where love transcends physical existence, where marriage continues beyond the grave. It's not madness exactly, it's something more unsettling. She's created her own world, with its own rules, its own logic, its own impossible truth. And in that world, she's not a grieving widow, she's a devoted wife. The smell has become legendary. Visitors to the palace speak of it in hushed tones, describing the way it hits you like a physical blow, the way it seems to cling to your clothes, your hair, your skin. It's not just the smell of death, it's the smell of love refusing to acknowledge death. It's the scent of devotion pushed beyond all reasonable limits. It's the odor of a woman who has chosen love over sanity, connection over reality, marriage over mortality. The political crisis deepens. Spain needs leadership, but their queen is preoccupied with a dead man. Her father has started making arrangements to take control, to have her declared unfit, to remove her from power. The nobles are nervous, the people are confused, and the international community is watching with fascination and horror. But Juana doesn't seem concerned. She has Philip, and Philip is all she needs. The kingdom, the crown, the responsibilities of rulership, they're all secondary to her primary obligation. The children have stopped visiting entirely. It's too disturbing, too confusing, too traumatic for them to witness their mother's conversations with their dead father. They're being raised elsewhere by people who can provide them with a more normal environment. But Juana doesn't seem to notice their absence. She has Philip, and Philip fills her world completely. The living, with their demands and expectations and judgments, have become irrelevant. She's chosen the dead over the living, and she's convinced she's made the right choice. The servants whisper about possession, about the way grief can transform into something else, something more dangerous. But when they observe her, she doesn't seem mentally ill. She's lucid, articulate, capable of complex thought and decision-making. She's not hallucinating, not hearing voices, not experiencing delusions. She simply has a different understanding of what death means. In her world, Philip is still Philip, still her husband, still the man she loves. He's just changed his form of communication. The doctors have given up trying to explain her behavior in medical terms. It's not melancholy, not hysteria, not any recognized form of mental illness. It's something else entirely, something that doesn't fit their understanding of human psychology. She's not mourning, she's not grieving, she's not experiencing the normal progression of loss. She's simply continuing her marriage as if death were just another minor inconvenience, like rain or political opposition. The international implications are staggering. Spain is one of the most powerful nations in Europe, and their queen is living with a corpse. Alliances are being questioned, treaties are being reconsidered, and enemies are seeing opportunities. The political stability of the entire continent is being affected by one woman's refusal to accept her husband's death. It's a personal tragedy that has become an international crisis. But Juana doesn't care about any of this. She has Philip, and Philip is all she needs. The world can whisper about madness. The church can demand proper burial. The nobles can plot against her. But she has something more important than their approval. She has love, pure and complete and eternal. And that love, she believes, is worth any price, any sacrifice, any consequence. The preservation has become a science. Daily applications of oils and herbs, careful positioning to prevent further decay, elaborate systems of air circulation and temperature control. It's a massive undertaking, requiring the full-time attention of skilled professionals. But it's also a labor of love, a way of honoring the relationship that death hasn't ended. Every day of preservation is another day of marriage, another day of love, another day of refusing to let death win. The political crisis reaches a breaking point. Her father has moved to have her declared unfit to take control of her kingdom. The nobles have started making their own arrangements, preparing for a new regime. The people are confused and frightened, uncertain about their future under a queen who spends her days talking to a dead man. But Juana doesn't seem concerned. She has Philip, and Philip is all she needs. The kingdom, the crown, the responsibilities of rulership, they're all secondary to her primary obligation. The smell has become a tourist attraction. People travel from across Europe to experience it, to witness the impossible devotion of a queen who refuses to let death end her marriage. They come expecting madness and find something more complex, more disturbing, more moving. They see a woman who has chosen love over sanity, connection over reality, marriage over mortality, and they leave questioning their own understanding of what love means, what commitment requires, what death actually accomplishes. The church has escalated to excommunication threats. Proper burial is not optional, they insist. Christian dignity requires respect for the dead. But Juana has her own understanding of Christian love. Love is eternal, she argues. God is love. Therefore, her love for Philip is holy, sacred, something to be honored, not buried. The church can quote scripture about the living and the dead, but she has scripture too. Love never ends, Paul wrote. She's simply taking him literally. The practical challenges multiply daily. The smell requires constant attention, expensive perfumes, elaborate air circulation systems. The preservation requires daily maintenance, careful positioning, regular applications of oils and herbs. The security requires guards who can stomach the sight and smell of decomposition. The diplomacy requires explanations that sound reasonable to foreign courts who have never encountered anything like this. It's a massive undertaking, all in service of a relationship with a dead man. The end, when it comes, is both inevitable and heartbreaking. The political pressure becomes too great, the international implications too serious, the practical challenges too overwhelming. Juana is removed from power, declared unfit, confined to a life of carefully supervised normalcy. Philip is finally buried, with all the proper Christian dignity that the church demanded. The marriage is ended, the relationship is severed, the love is forced to acknowledge death. But even in defeat, there's something magnificent about her devotion. She didn't mourn Philip, she loved him. She didn't grieve for what was lost, she celebrated what continued. She didn't accept death as an ending, she treated it as a transition. It was impossible, insane, deeply disturbing, but it was also the most complete expression of love anyone had ever witnessed. She chose love over sanity, connection over reality, marriage over mortality, and for a few impossible months she made it work. The legend of Juana the Mad lives on, but it's not really about madness. It's about love pushed beyond all reasonable limits, about devotion that refuses to acknowledge death, about a woman who chose connection over sanity and called it victory. She kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, traveled across Spain with his coffin, and held conversations with a man who had been dead for months. It was impossible, unprecedented, and unforgettable. She wasn't mad, she was devoted, and that devotion, impossible as it was, became something larger than life, larger than death, larger than the reasonable world that eventually forced her to surrender. She lost the battle, but she won something else. She proved that love, even impossible love, even love that defies death itself, can be more powerful than the forces that try to contain it. And in a world that often treats love as a luxury, that's not a small victory. The queen, who kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, wasn't crazy. She was committed. And that commitment, impossible as it was, became the stuff of legend. Not because it was reasonable, but because it was complete. Not because it made sense, but because it made love more important than sense. And in the end, that's what made her story not just impossible, but unforgettable. Years later, when historians tried to understand what happened in those impossible months, they struggled to find the right words. Madness seemed too simple, too dismissive of the complexity of what they witnessed. Love seemed too romantic, too clean for something so disturbing and obsessive. Grief seemed too temporary, too normal for something so unprecedented and extreme. What they found instead was something that didn't fit their categories, something that challenged their understanding of human behavior, human devotion, human possibility. The servants who survived those months never spoke of it lightly. They'd seen something that defied explanation, something that made them question their own understanding of love, death, and the boundaries between sanity and devotion. They'd witnessed a woman transform grief into something else entirely, something that was neither acceptance nor denial, but a third option that shouldn't have existed. They'd watched her create a new reality where death was just another obstacle to overcome, where love was stronger than mortality, where marriage continued beyond the grave. The smell, they said, was the worst part. Not just because it was overwhelming, though it was, but because it represented something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. It was the smell of love refusing to acknowledge death, of devotion pushed beyond all reasonable limits, of a woman who had chosen connection over sanity and called it victory. It was the scent of the impossible made manifest, of reality bent to serve love instead of the other way around. The political consequences rippled across Europe for decades. Spain's moment of weakness, caused by a queen who chose love over leadership, created opportunities for enemies and challenges for allies. Treaties were reconsidered, alliances were questioned, and the balance of power shifted in ways that would affect the continent for generations. All because one woman refused to accept that death ends relationships, that love has limits, that marriage is bound by mortality. But the personal consequences were even more profound. Juana's children grew up knowing that their mother had chosen a dead man over living children, that she'd prioritized a relationship with a corpse over her responsibilities to them. It shaped their understanding of love, of commitment, of the price of devotion. They learned that love could be dangerous, that it could consume everything else, that it could make rational people do impossible things. The church struggled to understand what they'd witnessed. Was it devotion or delusion? Was it holy love or unholy obsession? Was it a woman honoring her marriage vows or violating the natural order? They had scripture about love being eternal, but they also had doctrines about proper respect for the dead. They had examples of saints who'd experienced mystical unions, but they also had warnings about the dangers of excessive attachment to earthly things. Juana didn't fit their categories, didn't follow their rules, didn't accept their authority over her understanding of love. The medical community was equally baffled. She wasn't insane, at least not in any way they could diagnose. She was lucid, articulate, capable of complex reasoning. She understood that Philip was dead, she wasn't hallucinating his presence, she wasn't experiencing delusions. She simply refused to accept that death changed their relationship. It was a form of denial so complete, so systematic, so functional that it created its own reality. She wasn't living in a fantasy. She was living in a world where love was stronger than death, where commitment transcended mortality, where marriage continued beyond the grave. The international community watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Here was one of the most powerful women in Europe, ruler of one of the most important kingdoms, living with a corpse and calling it marriage. It was unprecedented, scandalous, and somehow deeply moving. Because underneath the impossible circumstances, underneath the obvious madness of the situation, there was something pure about her devotion. She wasn't performing grief, she wasn't seeking attention, she wasn't trying to make a political statement. She was simply loving her husband with a completeness that death couldn't touch. The preservation techniques became legendary in their own right. The daily applications of oils and herbs, the careful positioning to prevent further decay, the elaborate systems of air circulation and temperature control. It was a science born of desperation, a technology of love pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Every day of successful preservation was another day of marriage, another day of love, another day of refusing to let death win. It was impossible, impractical, and incredibly expensive. But it worked for a while. The conversations she held with Philip became the stuff of court gossip and international intrigue. What did she say to a dead man? How did she interpret his silence? What responses did she imagine? What conversations did she construct? What relationship did she maintain with someone who could no longer participate? The servants who overheard these one-sided discussions reported that she spoke to him as if he were still alive, still capable of response, still interested in the affairs of the kingdom and the welfare of their children. She told him about the letters from her father, about the pressure to allow burial, about the whispers of madness that followed her through the palace. She asked his opinion on matters of state, on the education of their children, on the management of their household. She shared her fears, her hopes, her plans for the future. It was intimate, tender, and completely insane, but it was also the most complete expression of marital devotion anyone had ever witnessed. The children's absence became more painful as time passed. They were being raised elsewhere by people who could provide them with a more normal environment. a more conventional understanding of family life. But Juana missed them, spoke to Philip about them, worried about their development without their parents' guidance. She was torn between her devotion to her dead husband and her responsibilities to her living children. And in that impossible choice, she chose the dead over the living, the past over the future, the marriage over the family. The international implications continued to unfold. Spain's enemies saw opportunity in their queen's impossible behavior. Alliances were questioned, treaties were reconsidered, and the balance of power began to shift. The woman who had once been one of the most powerful rulers in Europe was now seen as a liability, a source of weakness that could be exploited. Her love for Philip, so complete and so consuming, had become a threat to the very kingdom she was supposed to protect. But Juana didn't care about any of this. She had made her choice, and she was prepared to live with the consequences. She had chosen love over power, devotion over duty, marriage over monarchy. It was impossible, impractical, and ultimately self-destructive. But it was also the most authentic expression of love anyone had ever witnessed. She wasn't mourning what was lost, she was celebrating what continued. She wasn't grieving for the past, she was living in an eternal present where love transcended death. The smell became a symbol of her impossible devotion. Visitors to the palace would speak of it in hushed tones, describing the way it hit them like a physical blow, the way it seemed to cling to everything it touched. It was the smell of love refusing to acknowledge death, of devotion pushed beyond all reasonable limits, of a woman who had chosen connection over sanity and called it victory. It was overwhelming, nauseating, and somehow deeply moving. The political crisis reached its inevitable conclusion. Her father moved to have her declared unfit to take control of her kingdom. The nobles abandoned her, the church condemned her, and the international community wrote her off as a madwoman. The practical challenges became too great, the political implications too serious, the personal cost too high. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be death. The end came not with violence or drama, but with the quiet efficiency of political necessity. Guards entered the palace, physicians declared her unfit, and officials took control of the kingdom. Philip was finally buried, with all the proper Christian dignity that the church demanded. The marriage was ended, the relationship was severed, the love was forced to acknowledge death. It was over, but it had been magnificent. Even in defeat, there was something heroic about her devotion. She had fought the ultimate battle, love against mortality, and she had held the field for months. She had created her own reality, one where death was just another obstacle to overcome, where love was stronger than the forces that tried to contain it. She had proved that human devotion could transcend human limitations, that love could be more powerful than death, that marriage could continue beyond the grave. The legend of Juana the Mad spread across Europe and beyond. But it wasn't really about madness, it was about love pushed beyond all reasonable limits. It was about a woman who refused to accept that death ends relationships, who chose devotion over sanity, who made love more important than life itself. She had kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, traveled across Spain with his coffin, and held conversations with a man who had been dead for months. It was impossible, unprecedented, and unforgettable. She wasn't mad, she was devoted. And that devotion, impossible as it was, became something larger than life, larger than death, larger than the reasonable world that eventually forced her to surrender. She lost the battle, but she won something else. She proved that love, even impossible love, even love that defies death itself, can be more powerful than the forces that try to contain it. And in a world that often treats love as a luxury, that's not a small victory. The queen, who kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, wasn't crazy. She was committed. And that commitment, impossible as it was, became the stuff of legend. Not because it was reasonable, but because it was complete. Not because it made sense, but because it made love more important than sense. And in the end, that's what made her story not just impossible, but unforgettable. She had chosen love over everything else, and for a few, impossible. Months she had made it work. That's not madness, that's devotion. And devotion, even impossible devotion, is always worth remembering. But the story doesn't end with her defeat. Even after Philip was buried, even after she was declared unfit and removed from power, Juana's devotion continued to burn. Confined to a life of carefully supervised normalcy, she never stopped loving her dead husband. She never remarried, never moved on, never accepted that death had ended their relationship. She spent the rest of her long life as a living monument to impossible love, a woman who had touched something beyond normal human experience and could never quite return to the ordinary world. The confinement was meant to be therapeutic, restorative, a way of bringing her back to reality. But Juana had no interest in reality, at least not the version that everyone else accepted. She had seen something else, experienced something else, lived something else. She had discovered that love could transcend death, that devotion could overcome mortality, that marriage could continue beyond the grave. And having seen that, having lived that, she couldn't pretend to be satisfied with ordinary human limitations. The years passed slowly in her confinement. She was treated kindly, given comfortable quarters, provided with everything she needed except the one thing she actually wanted. Philip was gone, truly gone now, buried in the proper Christian manner that the church had demanded. But his absence from her daily life didn't diminish her love for him. If anything, it intensified it. She had lost the physical presence, the daily conversations, the ritual of caring for his body. But she had gained something else, something that couldn't be taken away by political decree or religious authority. She had gained the pure essence of their love, stripped of all the impossible complications that had made it so scandalous. She no longer had to defend her devotion, no longer had to justify her choices, no longer had to maintain the elaborate systems that had kept Philip's body preserved. She could simply love him, completely and without reservation, in the privacy of her own heart. It was a different kind of devotion, but it was no less complete, no less consuming, no less transformative. The servants who cared for her during this period reported that she was calm, peaceful, even serene. She had stopped fighting the world, stopped trying to make others understand her choices. She had retreated into an inner life where her love for Philip could flourish without interference, without judgment, without the practical complications that had made their impossible relationship so difficult to maintain. She had found a way to be with him that didn't require his physical presence, that didn't depend on political permission or religious approval. She spoke of him often, but not in the desperate, clinging way she had when his body was still with her. She spoke of him with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was, who he was, what he meant to her. She told stories about their life together, shared memories of their happiest moments, described their future reunion with the certainty of someone who had never doubted that love survives death. It was no longer about refusing to accept his death. It was about celebrating the eternal nature of their connection. The political world moved on without her. Spain found new leaders, new crises, new challenges. The kingdom that had once been paralyzed by her impossible devotion adapted, evolved, and thrived. Her absence from power was barely noticed after a few years. The nobles who had once whispered about her madness found new gossip to occupy their attention. The international community that had once watched her with fascination and horror turned their focus to other scandals, other crises, other impossible situations. But Juana didn't care about any of this. She had never really cared about power, about politics, about the approval of others. She had cared about love, about Philip, about the relationship that had defined her life and given it meaning. And that love, that relationship, that meaning, none of it had been diminished by her confinement. If anything, it had been purified, concentrated, refined into something even more essential and powerful. The children grew up without her, raised by others who could provide them with a more conventional understanding of family life. They learned to think of their mother as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of excessive devotion, a reminder that love could be dangerous if it wasn't properly controlled. But they also learned something else, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They learned that love could be. Stronger than death, that devotion could transcend mortality, that human beings were capable of connections that defied ordinary understanding. The church eventually stopped trying to understand what they had witnessed. They had their doctrines about proper respect for the dead, their teachings about the dangers of excessive attachment to earthly things. But they also had their scriptures about love being eternal, their examples of saints who had experienced mystical unions, their promises that death would not separate those who truly loved each other. Juana didn't fit their categories, but she didn't contradict their deepest beliefs either. She was simply living those beliefs more completely than anyone had thought possible. The medical community continued to study her case, to try to understand what they had witnessed. They had their diagnoses, their theories, their explanations for why a rational person might behave in such an irrational way. But they also had their admission that she wasn't insane, at least not in any way they could recognize or treat. She was something else, something that challenged their understanding of human psychology, human possibility, human limitation. The international community eventually forgot about her, moved on to other scandals, other crises, other impossible situations. But the story of the queen who kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks continued to circulate, to inspire, to disturb. It became a legend, a cautionary tale, a love story, a tragedy, a comedy, a mystery. It was all of these things, and none of them. Because it was something that didn't fit ordinary categories, something that challenged ordinary understanding, something that revealed ordinary limits to be less absolute than people wanted to believe. The preservation techniques she had used became the subject of scholarly study. How had she managed to keep Philip's body relatively intact for so long? What oils had she used? What herbs? What methods of air circulation and temperature control? It was a science born of desperation, a technology of love pushed beyond all reasonable limits. But it was also a genuine achievement, a demonstration that human ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when motivated by sufficient devotion. The conversations she had held with Philip became the subject of philosophical debate. What did it mean to maintain a relationship with someone who could no longer respond? How did love function when separated from its object? What was the difference between memory and presence, between devotion and delusion, between love and obsession? These questions had no easy answers, but they were important questions. Questions that revealed the complexity of human emotion, human connection, human possibility. The smell, that overwhelming, nauseating, somehow deeply moving smell that had permeated the palace during those impossible months, became a symbol of something larger than itself. It was the smell of love refusing to acknowledge death, of devotion pushed beyond all reasonable limits, of a woman who had chosen connection over sanity and called it victory. It was the scent of the impossible made manifest, of reality bent to serve love instead of the other way around. The political consequences of her actions continued to ripple through European history for decades. The moment of weakness caused by her impossible devotion had created opportunities for enemies and challenges for allies. Treaties had been reconsidered, alliances had been questioned, and the balance of power had shifted in ways that would affect the continent for generations. All because one woman had refused to accept that death ends relationships, that love has limits, that marriage is bound by mortality. But the personal consequences were even more profound and lasting. Juana had proved that human beings were capable of love that transcended death, devotion that overcame mortality, connections that defied ordinary understanding. She had shown that the boundaries between life and death, between sanity and madness, between possible and impossible, were less absolute than people wanted to believe. She had lived something that shouldn't have been possible, and in doing so, she had expanded the realm of human possibility for everyone who heard her story. The servants who had witnessed those impossible months carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged their understanding of love, death, and the boundaries between them. They had watched a woman transform grief into something else entirely, something that was neither acceptance nor denial, but a third option that shouldn't have existed. They had witnessed the impossible made real, the unthinkable made daily routine, the unbearable made bearable through the sheer force of devotion. And in their memories, in their stories, in their whispered conversations about what they had seen, Juana's love for Philip continued to live. It was no longer about preserving a corpse or maintaining an impossible relationship. It was about preserving the memory of what human love could achieve when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. It was about maintaining the possibility that death might not be the final word, that love might be stronger than mortality, that human beings might be capable of connections that transcend ordinary understanding. The legend grew with each telling, each retelling, each new interpretation. Juana became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a love story, a tragedy, a comedy, a mystery. She was the mad queen who kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, the devoted wife who refused to let death end her marriage, the woman who chose love over sanity and called it victory. She was all of these things and none of them, because she was something that didn't fit ordinary categories, something that challenged ordinary understanding, something that revealed ordinary limits to be less absolute than people wanted to believe. And in the end, that's what made her story not just impossible, but essential. She had lived something that shouldn't have been possible, and in doing so, she had proved that human beings were capable of more than they imagined. She had loved someone beyond death, beyond reason, beyond the boundaries that society tried to impose on human emotion. She had created her own reality, one where love was stronger than death, where devotion could overcome mortality, where marriage could continue beyond the grave. It was impossible, impractical, and ultimately unsuccessful, but it was also magnificent, inspiring, and unforgettable. She had chosen love over everything else, and for a few impossible months she had made it work. That's not madness, that's devotion. And devotion, even impossible devotion, especially impossible devotion, is always worth remembering. Because in remembering it, we expand our own understanding of what love can achieve, what human beings are capable of, what might be possible if we're willing to push beyond the boundaries that others try to impose on us. The queen, who kept her dead husband in her bedroom for weeks, wasn't crazy. She was committed, and that commitment, impossible as it was, became something larger than life, larger than death, larger than the reasonable world that eventually forced her to surrender. She lost the battle, but she won something else. She proved that love, even impossible love, even love that defies death itself, can be more powerful than the forces that try to contain it. And in a world that often treats love as a luxury, that's not a small victory. That's a revolution.